Mhm.
Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, the regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining us this afternoon, we have Mike McGovern, Principal and Global Head of Technology Engagement for Investor Services at Brown Brothers Harriman, as well as Anthony Woodward, Founder and CEO of RecordPoint. We're here to discuss why adopting comprehensive data governance practices can allow organizations to ensure reliability, ethics, and security of their AI systems, ultimately driving better business outcomes. Certainly sounds like that privacy first, cyber first mentality driving the culture at organizations these days. Anthony, tell us what's driving tech stack decisions at this point.
Oh, look, there's a multitude of factors, but I'd be very remiss to not start with AI and the whole notion of agentic behavior. Every room, every conversation I walk into right now is talking about AI. And look, I think really when you talk about tech stack, at the very bottom of that is data. So it really is a conversation about data everywhere.
Yeah, and Michael, you make that note as well, that the one with the data wins. Essentially, data is the commodity these days.
Well, I mean, if you go back to the big the five V's that we love, being a data guy through and through, whether it's volume, variety, veracity, velocity, or value, it's really the focus on value that I think AI drives now a completely different next level set of opportunities beyond all the data we've been collecting. So in an AI world, the one with the data wins, but you need to have the right data organized in the right way with the right mapping, actually, it turns out, to get the models to do the dance and deliver what I think Peter Drucker described as real strategic business information, data imbued with relevance and purpose.
Right. So, Anthony, really what's going to differentiate enterprise is how sophisticated the end result is and how they're differentiating themselves with all of this data at their disposal.
Yeah, absolutely. Those that are going to win are those that really understand their data. And I think much like Mike just said, it is about being able to augment the data. Metadata has been a word we've talked about for a long time, with an ability to understand its context. Because just having raw data by itself isn't particularly useful. It needs to be organized, it needs to be curated, it needs to be understood what its impact is and also what its relevance is. So, words that aren't used a lot in technology, but we use a lot at RecordPoint are things like provenance. We've talked a long time in the data world about lineage, but we haven't talked about provenance. What is it that it actually purports to be, and how do you know that it's accurate?
Yeah. And part of the exercise is removing stagnant data.
Well, that's part of the provenance, right? So, in order to have good provenance, you need to get rid of the things that are not relevant. So, how do you actually triage that data down and begin to understand what's hidden within that data so it becomes, economically useful? It's pointless having the morning tea roster and who bought in the cakes last week. Whilst it's nice to have that, it's not a particularly provident piece of information versus, the transactions we did with customers and, what their feedback was on those transactions.
Yeah. And Michael, part of the challenge with that as well is connecting legacy systems and integrating them with new technologies, because it's not a set it and forget it exercise. This is something that's ongoing in today's, day and age, and working with these emerging technologies as they evolve.
Absolutely. I think the traditional strategies for connecting legacy systems with new tech, encapsulation and enterprise service buses and the likes, they still have a role. But I think of it as a data problem writ large. That is to say, pan enterprise. And historically, we've had enough trouble just trying to capture the context of use, as Anthony was alluding to, in our own enterprise. But in the world we live in now, in the what I call the digital fast forward environment in which we are operating, we rely on suppliers and providers, and indeed our clients that we serve and their clients, all part of that ecosystem. So being able to deliver the data about the data and trust it, provenance as Anthony described it, and understanding the context of use from an information architecture standpoint, right? People, process, context.
Right.
That's those investments. Organizations that focus on those investments and deploy them at the edge where value is delivered are the organizations that will win in the future and continue to win in the present.
Yeah. And Anthony, let's talk about that a bit more, because as the tech stack increases and the attack surfaces just get larger, what are some of the risks that companies are facing, and how should you think about mitigating that as you construct your response plan?
Yeah, look, such an interesting question we could talk for hours on, but the reality of these data breaches, and we see this a lot in the banking customers we work with across the globe, is the over retention of data is in fact the biggest risk. So, we have all sorts of legacy systems inside enterprises that aren't, let's be real, the front-facing newer systems are actually relatively well protected in most enterprises today. But the old legacy systems, which have a treasure trove of data, are the ones that are extremely vulnerable. And so we go back to the point we we're making earlier about reducing your obsolete and trivial data, that's so key to being able to think about security and management. It is all about triaging and managing the data for risk, and then being able to deal with that, again, in these legacy systems in a way that's going to set the enterprise up for success.
Yeah. And I'd say, Anthony, that we think about it in terms of having to have fit for purpose protections and instrumentation for data in use, data in motion, data at rest. And historically, data at rest, which is where you're going, is been the least served. But it basically boils down to a number of strategies that start with data encryption. And sophisticated or at least context-aware data retention capabilities, like you were alluding to, that I think are the basic frames that organizations have to focus on. And then I'd say the AI, sort of revolution takes things to a completely different level, where the attack surface now grows and morphs into areas that have to be protected against, such things as prompt injections and data poisoning of the data that's being used to train models, et cetera. So much more to do in this brave new world.
Yeah, there certainly is. And Michael, Anthony had used the word triage before. And when you think about managing increasing costs that are associated with technology, because the market is so competitive, you want to be first, you want to find the solutions for the problems that your clients have. At the same time, though, especially if you're thinking in financial services, there's a lot of regulatory pressure. There's a lot of compliance that goes along with it. It is not a nice to have. It is a need to have right now when it comes to data governance and cybersecurity. In fact, it could be a competitive advantage at the end of the day. How do you think about managing those costs and getting that buy-in across the organization?
Well, there's a lot there, Jill. But it starts with architecting your systems for compliance. And privacy, and building in those characteristics that need to be there to be able to demonstrate to your regulators, in the case of a regulated financial institution like Brown Brothers, that we've done the right things every step of the way. In terms of the impact on costs, I think one of the sort of key architectural strategies that cuts across all of that is reuse of data definitions, data objects, code objects, reliable performance reuse of capabilities that have been developed in a way that they can support both, I'll call it, standard products and product innovation. And so that's really what we've been focused on. We have something called the Intermediary Data Fabric at BDH. And it turns out that when you put care and attention into how you construct and expose code objects and data objects and have reliable reuse of those objects, everything you've done right already is brought forward into the things you need to do right tomorrow.
Yeah. And if I could add, that all just comes down to that metadata thing we talked about at the very outset when we talked about AI. There was a big push in the 2000s to do master data management and those things, and to real mixed results. But if we look at the world today, if you don't have the metadata that's describing what's underneath it and what, in fact, is the security controls around the metadata. And that's a new concept for many
Indeed.
folk. Then you're in real trouble.
Yeah, well, Anthony, you had brought up the point before that AI is being levered by the good and the bad actors when it comes to safeguarding data and really coming up with a comprehensive data governance plan. How can these emerging technologies help for the purposes of good as it relies to reliability and ethics and thinking, security first or security by design across the organization, like embedded, in the culture of it?
Yeah, look, it's a somewhat overused term, but the whole notion of shifting left is so key to what we need to do today. And what I mean by that is being able to look upstream to how the data is constructed and used and how the code on the data is constructed, so that you can think about what are the controls for the audiencing you need. So in an AI world, ultimately, we're really giving the AI a ton of data to trawl through to build its models. And when we think about those models, there are many systems and many people that have access to that data. And the traditional rules that we've applied to that world don't apply anymore. So the old processes, the old mindsets need to be reset. And we have to think about how we're actually going to create different boundaries between the data sets. And again, this all comes down, and I'll use again the metadata term, but it all comes down to how you're describing the data and the use of that data and understanding what is the different uses within the organization. And those can be things like what are the privacy controls that are relevant to a piece of data out of California versus the privacy controls that are relevant to New York. And you need to understand that or you're going to get into trouble really fast.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think that's part of why you're seeing that shift where enterprise is turning to more GDPR-like framework. I believe it's 78%. I read this stat yesterday. I can't remember. I don't remember who to attribute it to, but that you're seeing enterprise increasingly go towards a GDPR-like or California, even Colorado in certain circumstances, so that they are at the highest level of compliance, not only for cost efficiency, because it can be incredibly expensive to manage multiple jurisdictions, but just to manage the compliance and risk modeling process. And I think part of standardizing that, Michael, is for organizations to also think about collaboration as it involves compliance and risk modeling. Silos just aren't going to work anymore. You need to be able to have that bird's eye view.
That's right. And I think it's about the bird's eye view, and it's about the connectivity that is secure and standards based and delivers, to all of those standards, whether it's general data protection in Europe or standards that are emerging in new, domains like digital assets with the Genius Act and other legislation that is coming. So, we think of it in terms of being able to provide reliable interoperability infrastructure. We call it Infomediary, and we have a product set around that. And we think of ourselves as operating in the institutional financial services space. We have to adhere to all those standards. We're a US-based bank, but we operate in Europe. We operate in Asian markets like Hong Kong and Tokyo. So, we have to retain and adhere to a superset of regulatory, supervisory, and quality and integrity standards. And so we think that having tooling, having interoperability capabilities that extend that set of controls and in a robust way across not only our own enterprise but our providers, suppliers, and clients is the way forward.
Yeah. And Anthony, I still think it comes down to the front line, which are people, right? You can't just rely on emerging technologies to be the one size fits all solution. Most breaches are a result of frontline vulnerabilities.
Yeah, when we talk about data governance and we talk about managing information per se, it is all about the training and some of the processes you've got for individuals in the organization. So we can't just talk about the systems. We have to talk about the underlying capabilities that we're putting into people so they can think about security and compliance and the legal factors that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. And it is complex. So, I think some of the best organizations in the world are really not only training, but also reporting on the processes that folk have and how, gamifying how they can actually integrate data into their world.
Yeah, I think it's a competitive advantage at the end of the day, right? If I'm a client, this is certainly how I'd want to, especially with today's supply chain and third-party vendors and so forth, I would pick a vendor based on that would be a big factor, in terms of why I would pick a supplier, a vendor. So there certainly is competitive advantage, which I think helps the cybersecurity professionals and risk managers get that buy-in from the C-suite and the board because you're able to turn this into a business case. It's not a cost center anymore.
I think that's exactly right, Jill. I think that's the way we look at it, is it's a competitive advantage because you're taking the control, posture, and robustness of the way you treat data within your enterprise, and you're exposing those capabilities to use by our clients and their suppliers in their value chain to their clients. So it's about integrating that value chain in a way that that allows our clients, so they see it as a characteristic of our products, that they're secure, that they're robust, that they're compliant, and that they're governed in the right way, and regardless of what standard you have to deal with in whatever part of the world you happen to operate.
I'd say that's changed too considerably, that it's now just table stakes. If you're not doing these things, you can't even operate. Like, it's not, I'd say it's even almost lower than competitive advantage. It's existence. Like, if you look at the recent Gartner AI survey, and I think there are some gaps here for us to talk about, those that are actively implementing AI have data governance problems. And the stat that I've heard is 46% of organizations have a data governance problem from Gartner. And that data governance problem actually primarily starts at skills, like we talked about earlier. The staff just don't have the skills to actually look at data and understand its use cases and understand its application. And there isn't, in the general community, when we talk about tech stack, a production first mentality. So they're not thinking about the level of curation. There's still a lot of things in Excel spreadsheets that are extremely important to organizations that track these things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes it more expensive to reverse engineer if you're not thinking cyber privacy governance first, because if you have an incident or if you're in the process of integrating newer technologies and having to reverse engineer that and, get with, within compliance of multiple jurisdictions and global regulations, it is incredibly expensive to make that fix when it's something that could have been addressed in the design.
Absolutely. That's
very much so.
You've left, right? Like I was talking about earlier, that you've got to do it early. You've got to do it early or it just catches you.
Yeah, I quite agree with that. I do think that, in our case, as a regulated financial institution and a specialist firm, we do security services, wealth management. We see the subject matter expertise that we apply to the data as being a significant part of the value that we deliver. And in fact, we have clients who, trust us to deliver within their value chains, publishing data to Morningstar and Lipper on their behalf and to their clients. So they're distribution partners. So that's where we see an attribute of data that we haven't talked a lot about, trust, that underlies everything that we have been saying, I think. And that context specific trust is still very valuable, at least in the eyes of our clients.
Well, and that's exactly where the competitive advantage comes into play, as we discussed earlier. Appreciate both of your insights. So. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for joining me on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Anthony.